Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Very good. Welcome everyone. For those who remember, the last time that we were together, we went through some very, very profound verses of the Narada Bhakti Sutras. And the video of that I know is available, so hopefully those who weren't here had a chance to see the video. In those verses, among other things, we spoke about the nature of the gopis, why the gopis are of such importance, but also how is it that we can emulate the gopis, which is, of course, for us, very, very important. It's wonderful to know what is the nature of those individuals, these gopis, and why they are considered to be such incredibly high and advanced yogis and bhaktas. But more, of course, we are meant to replicate such people. We're meant to follow in their footsteps. And how do we do that? Not easily. Not easily. The way that we do that is by trying to inculcate within ourselves the sort of devotion that they had, which is, again, no small thing. But that is the goal. You see, for anyone who is a highly accomplished person, people who want to really achieve things of great importance in life, we know that we cannot do this unless we have models, unless we have exemplars. And do we want those exemplars to be an inch above us? No, of course not. It actually serves our interest if those people who are our models are so above us to the point where the very thought of trying to reach that station seems to us almost impossible. That is a model. That is someone who we want to have as an example, someone who we can aspire toward being like. So the gopis are among such individuals who, when we understand the nature of their devotion, which, again, hopefully last time that we got together, we have some inkling now of just how amazingly high their devotion is. When we see something like this, at first we think to ourselves, oh, how can I ever achieve something like this in my lifetime? But then, of course, we begin to see that we ourselves begin to have a little inkling of that, but then a greater inkling, and then a greater inkling. And then we understand why our exemplars are so high above us. That yes, at first it can seem almost an impossibility, but then we begin to appreciate these individuals and what they have attained. And little by little we understand that yes, this is our goal as well. So that's what we talked about last time, but now we're going to go through a little bit more of the Narada Bhakti Sutras, and again several verses that form another theme. And I won't tell you really what this theme is, I think it'll be self-explanatory. But hopefully everyone has their copy of the Narada Bhakti Sutras. And again, this is my personal translation of this, which eventually will be released in book form, not just yet. First, we'll finish this class, and then at some point in the future, my translation will be released in actual book form. So we ended with verse 26, and we will begin with verse 27 of Narada Bhakti Sutras. So I'll read this to everyone. And we see with that very first word that this is a continuation in thought of what was said previously. Furthermore, the Supreme Godhead is displeased with those who are arrogantly egotistical and is affectionate to those who have humility. So a dual statement here, negative and a positive statement. Negative and a positive statement. And more, this is a statement which very specifically and purposefully is aligned with God, with Ishvara, with the Supreme Being. So this is to emphasize how important this is. You see, this is not saying, oh, the Guru will be displeased, a collectivity of rishis will be displeased. No, God is displeased with X and pleased with Y. So again, this is to emphasize how important this is. So now let's go through this. Furthermore, the Supreme Godhead is displeased with those who are arrogantly egotistical. All right? And again, we'll talk about this clause first, but of course we know that these two clauses are tied. They're opposite sides of the same coin. They're mirror opposites. So let's start with that. Now, Why is it that being egotistical, and thus as a result of being egotistical, being arrogant, because arrogance is a subset of being egotistical, why is it that this is something that is so highly frowned upon? Why is it that it's something that is considered to be a terrible thing? Well, this is our primary disease spiritually. Our primary illness, our primary disease spiritually is indeed false ego, ahankara. This is known throughout the entire Vedic tradition, and more so, this is so much our root spiritual problem, to the point where there's almost no religion on earth that would disagree with this. That our main problem is what sometimes in the Western tradition is called the sin of pride. Thinking that we are the center of all things, thinking that, oh yes, all that matters is me. But then with a greater psychological understanding of the nature of ahankara that is given in yoga spirituality, Vedic spirituality, etc. Also having that illusory artificial sense of self. Ascribing selfhood to something that is not self. Explaining this again, psychologically. This is our main problem. We have a self. We have an identity. We have an ultimate identity. But we know that that ultimate identity, that true person who is experiencing all things, well, that true self unfortunately is covered by layer upon layer upon layer of what that self thinks is its real self, but which in actuality is not. And we've talked about this many, many times. This is fundamental to yoga spirituality. How we have all these various layers. The true self identifies first of all with ego, that is with that false identity in and of itself. But then it identifies falsely with the mind. All of these things occurring in our mind at any given time, and especially individuals who tend to be quote-unquote mental, people who just live in their minds all the time. These are individuals who are convinced that their thoughts are them. And then going a little bit further, those individuals who live in their emotions and they're convinced that what they're feeling at any given time, that is who they are. See, it's not just that I am having emotions and I am experiencing emotions, but I am the emotions. What am I? I am angry. What am I? I am sad. What am I? I am fill in the blank. I am that thing, you see? So again, a false identity, identifying with something which, while it's having an impact on us right then and there, it's temporary. As angry as a person can be, as angry as a person can be, that anger will go away in time. It reminds me of this movie, I wish I could remember the name. It was a comedy that came out in the 90s, and it was one of these wannabe superhero movies where there were these people pretending to be superheroes, and they didn't have real powers. But there was one superhero called Anger Man. And his power was that he could get really angry. That was his only power. And of course, it wasn't very effective. He'd get very angry and then they'd beat him up afterwards. And it wasn't very effective, number one. Number two, how can you sustain that artificially? Even to sustain real anger, you cannot do. But you certainly can't do it artificially. Again, we are not that anger. We're not those emotions. So this is the nature of ahankara, of ego. But then, ego taken to its, let's say, very worst and lowest degree, then it becomes arrogance. You see, it's bad enough if a person has a simple and almost innocent kind of ego. In other words, that they are simply an illusion. You can feel sorry for them for that. But then when you find those individuals who go to the extreme of actually being arrogant in their illusion, actually being prideful and actually thinking that, oh yes, I'm better than everyone else. Why? Because I am my money, because I am all of these possessions, because I am my power, etc., etc., etc. And who not only have a misidentification of true self, but use that misidentification as a weapon against others. That's the arrogance of egotism. So again, looking at this first clause, this is very important because it's discussing precisely what is our spiritual dilemma, our spiritual problem. And more, the Supreme Godhead is displeased with those who are arrogantly egotistical. Now, does God truthfully become displeased with individuals? Not in the deepest sense, obviously, not in the Atman sense. not in the sense of who we are as true consciousness. However, it displeases God in the sense of it makes God sad. It makes God feel pity and compassion toward individuals who are part and parcel of God, who have come from God, have God as their source, but yet are in such illusion that they themselves have artificially separated themselves from God. To say that God is pleased, see, if we were to say the opposite, if we were to say, oh, God is pleased with people's arrogant egotism, what would that mean? That God is pleased with our suffering and our imposing suffering upon ourselves. That's something that no loving God could ever be happy about, could ever be pleased about. So what is it that God is displeased about? Seeing that we are suffering, and more, that we are imposing that suffering upon ourselves. I mean, imagine this. To simply see someone in suffering because someone abused that person, because that person is a victim of someone else, that's bad enough. But then when you see that that individual has harmed themselves, no one else has harmed them, that is especially heartrending. So this is what this clause is talking about. But now let's look at the further clause. Again, this is now the opposite side of the coin. And the Supreme Godhead is affectionate toward those who have humility. Toward those who have humility. Now, for those who have been coming to my satsangs for years especially, you know that this is one of our themes, an endless theme talking about the importance of humility. And to this day, it is one of my greatest regrets about this world and about the world of spirituality as it exists today, that very few other spiritual teachers talk about the importance of humility. Feel free to visit other spiritual teachers, whatever they are, whether they're Vedic, whether they're Buddhist, whatever. Go to YouTube, watch hundreds and hundreds of these so-called spiritual teachers droning on and on about various things. Very rarely, if ever, will you hear them talk about the importance of humility, the importance of having a healthy humility, simply being humble, understanding what is our situation in life. It's something that's rarely spoken about today. Yet in the past meaning in a more traditional context of real and authentic spirituality and religion, whether in the Hindu context, the Buddhist context, Christian, whatever, humility has always been recognized as one of the chief virtues that we have to develop within ourselves. Now, why is this the case? As we can see from this very verse, humility is the very opposite of egotism. Humility is the very opposite of that which is the poison that is there psychologically within us. So, if we wish to combat this egotism, this arrogance that we have, thinking that we are the center of all reality, then what we are to do is cultivate its opposite, cultivate humility. And again, a healthy humility. Unfortunately, too many people, when they hear this word humility, of course, they think that humility means humiliation. It means that humility means, not having self-confidence. It means not believing in yourself, etc., etc. That is not humility. With a healthy humility, on the one hand, you understand, okay, this is my situation in life. This is realistically what my station is. I am not God. I am not the master of all I survey. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have a healthy self-pride. You have a healthy self-confidence. When you speak, you don't speak very meekly like this, but you speak in such a way that people can hear you. In other words, you act like a leader. You act like a leader. In fact, if anything, the greatest leaders in history are individuals who coupled within their person both of these seemingly contradictory characteristics, but which are not contradictory, in which, on the one hand, they led with supreme confidence, but at the same time understanding that they themselves were a servant of the people, a servant of God. But when they led without meekness. So this is what it means to be a spiritual person and to have healthy humility. That on the one hand, we understand, I am not God, I am a servant of God. But on the other hand, that when I am called to lead, I will lead. Very good. Let's go on to the next verse, verse 28. Some hold the opinion that the practice of knowledge alone is the means for attaining devotional consciousness or bhakti. Very good. So now Narada is talking very generally about some different opinions that, let's say, spiritual people in general have, whether they be simply practitioners or even philosophers, leaders, etc., spiritual teachers. This is one theory that people have, that jnana is the most important thing. In fact, that's the word that's used in Sanskrit here, is jnana. That is knowledge. That knowledge is the most important thing. And we meet people like this all the time. In fact, very specifically, the Advaita school of Shankaracharya, this is what they say, that jnana is indeed everything. You know, bhakti has maybe a little bit of a role for people who are less intelligent. They'll say very arrogantly, very arrogantly. Followers of Shankar will say, oh yes, for the unintelligent people, they can practice a little bhakti, you know, just be emotional little people until they come to the point of being intelligent like us and being able to philosophically discern what is the meaning of life. Well, this is the sort of people who Narada is speaking about. But then generally speaking also, individuals who think that the way to know the divine, the way to actually know truth is by intellect alone. That, oh yes, if I simply study and study and study, if I read enough books, if I go to enough very advanced teachers and sit at their feet and ask extremely deep and penetrating philosophical questions, and if I think and think and think and contemplate, eventually it will come to the point where I will know truth. All right, that's one theory. As of right now, Narada is not giving his opinion about that theory. He's simply saying that, yes, some hold that opinion. Now let's go on to the next verse, 29. While others feel that knowledge and devotional consciousness are mutually dependent. All right, well that's interesting. This is something that a lot of people would agree with, correct? That, oh, maybe they're mutually dependent. Maybe you need to have a little bit of jnana and a little bit of bhakti, and they're both equal. Yeah, my last clause again. And they're both equal. Correct? In fact, I won't ask who here in my audience maybe believes that that is the case. It sounds very fair, doesn't it? That, oh yes, both jnana and bhakti, yes, they both are important. All right? Well, again, Narada is not giving his opinion. But we know that, of course, this is a very easy default position for individuals to take because, again, it sounds fair, like so many things in our world today, in our postmodern world that sound very fair, so therefore they must be true. All right, well, let's go on and let's see what Narada actually has to say about this. So now, verse 30. And this, speaking about merciless, this is a merciless verse. Merciless in a good sense, meaning he holds nothing back. 30. But I, Narada, the son of Brahma, state that devotional consciousness, bhakti, is its own fruit. All right. This verse is a lot more powerful than we think. First of all, before he even states his opinion, he states with humility, but again, as a leader, as a spiritual teacher, he wants to make this clear that, oh yes, others have their opinion. That's nice. People can have their opinions. Now, this is what I say. And who am I? I am Narada Muni. I am the greatest of rishis, and I am the son of Brahma himself. I am the son of the creator of this world. Thus, Joe Schmo, this person, that person, Swami so-and-so, that person who just put out a new bestseller spouting on about Neo-Vedanta. Oh yes, they can have their opinions. That's nice. But I am Narada. I have been here since the dawn of creation. I have been the guru of some of the greatest gurus in history. I have been the guru of some of the greatest rishis in history. I'm extrapolating, of course, but really this is what Narada is saying. I am the guru of Vyasadeva. And who is Vyasadeva? He wrote the Mahabharata. This is Narada. Who am I? I am the son of the very being who created this universe. Now what do I say? And what does this amazing individual say? He says that devotional consciousness is its own fruit. Now, what does this mean exactly? The word that's used is phala. Phala means fruit. First, let's back up a little bit. We talked previously in the previous verse about jnana and bhakti. Now, does jnana play no part in our path? It does. But as subservient to bhakti, as subservient to that which is the ultimate goal. Here, puja. We just had a beautiful puja a few minutes ago, no? Does puja play no part in our path? Obviously, we have pujas all the time. Puja is very important. I teach all of my disciples how to have puja. I teach all of my disciples that they should have an altar at home and they should do puja and offer wonderful things to God. So puja plays a part in our path. But is it our path? Is it the goal of our path? Is our goal to be that we as individuals become so perfect at doing puja that eventually we become liberated and we go to a realm where there is just puja being done 24 hours a day, and puja, that's everything? Is that our path? Is that the goal? Of course not. Of course not. In the same way, is jnana important? Absolutely. Anyone who knows me knows the importance that, the emphasis that I put on jnana. It's very, very important. We have to think philosophically. We have to think with discernment, with discrimination. We have to be able to understand philosophically, intellectually, everything. We need to understand the history of our tradition, and it's an amazing history. We need to understand philosophy. We need to understand why we are doing what we are doing, what it is that we believe. Where have we come from? What is our present situation? What is our ultimate goal? We can only understand this philosophically. So we need to have philosophy as an important underpinning of everything that we're doing. However, this is what's important. Philosophy in and of itself, and I'll have to disagree with Socrates and Plato on this, philosophy in and of itself is not the goal. Rather, philosophy itself, as wonderful and as great as philosophy is, to the point where philosophy is a goddess. Philosophy is Sophia in the ancient Greek, and Saraswati is the personification of philosophy and of knowledge in Vedic culture. As important as philosophy is, philosophy herself offers her obeisances at the feet of bhakti, and bhakti offers her obeisances at the feet of Bhagavan, of Sriman Narayana. So this is what Narada is saying here, is that, yes, what is different about bhakti is that it is its own fruit. Now, what's meant by this? You have a tree. You have a tree in order that in time, while taking care of that tree, as a result of taking care of that tree, eventually there will be fruit. You have an apple tree. You take care of the tree. Eventually you'll have that fruit. You see? So your goal is not just to have an appleless apple tree. Oh, I have an apple tree in the backyard. It's been genetically modified so that it will never grow an apple, but I just like looking at it. Who would do that? You have an apple tree so that hopefully someday you'll have apples. You have an orange tree so that hopefully someday you'll have oranges, etc. Thus you have the fruit of that tree. Well, in the same way, if you have jnana alone, it's like having that appleless apple tree. You got a semi-nice tree to look at, but it will never bear fruit. Bhakti is different. It is that tree that bears fruit, and more, it is its very own fruit. In other words, as you've heard me say a million times, and now you're hearing Narada say it, so you know now I never made this up. Bhakti is different from every other sadhana, from every other form of yoga in existence, in that you can say this about no other yoga, that it is its own fruit. But you can say this about bhakti. Bhakti is both the means by which we know the divine, but it is also the goal. We practice bhakti in order to experience bhakti. We practice devotion in order to experience devotion. And that's what makes bhakti different. And again, this is not just me saying this anymore, as I've said for years. Now you've seen Narada says this. Let's go on now to 31. And now this is forming another nice little theme that we'll see. So 31. An example is given in the illustration of the king's palace and the dinner. So this verse is now just setting up what we're about to hear. That is that Narada is going to give two examples of what it is that he's speaking about. All right, so now let's go on to verse 32. And these are the examples. The king knows no satisfaction by simply seeing a palace, nor does the hungry person know peace by only seeing a meal. So, what he is, of course, comparing here is the simply seeing something. That's like jnana, by simply seeing it. So, in other words, to simply understand something theoretically, to understand not just something, to understand the absolute, that which is our goal, to simply understand this theoretically, it's like a king seeing a palace, but he can never enter into it. He'll always feel unfulfilled. Or it's like a hungry person. You can imagine a person who hasn't eaten in 30 days. Talk about torture. Imagine a person who hasn't eaten in like 30 days, and across the room you set up a banquet, and you say to the person, you can look, but you can't touch. That would be torture. But this is what it's like, being an individual who is simply a philosopher, simply an intellectual, having a theoretical grasp of, oh yes, God is wonderful, God is the source of all good, and the meaning of life is to experience this ecstasy of bhakti, and you can go on, and everything that you're saying is correct. But it's just words for you. You haven't actually experienced any of it. Again, it's similar to an individual seeing various things that are the goal, but not being able to achieve them, not being able to actually do anything with them. You can imagine, these are two wonderful examples. Starting with the king. You can imagine, who is a king? A king, you would imagine, in most situations, is an individual who has a powerful personality, who is a very strong, very courageous person. A person who was born to rule, was born to rule over a nation and direct how the nation should be governed, etc., etc. But they can never enter into the palace and actually begin acting as a king. It's all just, well, I know what a king acts like, and once I am a king, I know what I would do to benefit the people. I know that, oh yes, there are these projects, we need to irrigate these fields here in an area that's been very dry, and oh, in this particular area of my kingdom, there's great poverty, so we should do something about this, etc. All right, I want to do this all, but you can't even enter the palace. Imagine the frustration of such a thing. If one were a king and ready to begin, but you can't, and you can't, and you can't. And then, of course, with the second example, that's a little bit easier for most people to understand, because not everyone is a king, but everyone has to eat. Everyone has to eat. And we know how frustrating it would be, again, with the example I gave of that person who hasn't eaten in 30 days. But for any one of us, imagine if we are hungry and we can see the food, we understand what food is, we can even imagine how nice it would be to actually taste that food and actually feel food in my hungry belly again. But I can't. It will always be out of reach to me. In the same way, God is out of reach to those individuals for who God is just an interesting theory. This is why I give this example again and again. The first time I gave this example publicly was, I think it was June or July of the year 2000. I was being interviewed on ITV, Indian television. I forget the name of the woman who interviewed me, but there was a call-in show that I was on, and people were calling in and asking philosophical questions. And someone asked me, well, sir, how do you prove God's existence? And this was the first time that I gave this answer, and I've given it several times since then, but this was the first time I said this publicly. I said to the person who called into the show, prove God's existence? Yes, actually that can be done. Philosophically, logically, it can be done. And I knew that it could, because at that point I was still a graduate student, and I was studying with Keith Yandel, who at that time was one of the top 5, I believe, people in philosophy of religion on earth. And trust me, he alone could prove God's existence logically, using symbolic logic on a blackboard. He could literally prove God's existence philosophically, without doubt, to the point where no other contemporary philosopher at that time, 16 years ago, had ever been able to refute him. But I said to this person who was calling, and I said, oh yes, God can be proven philosophically, but what is the point? I said to the person. And then I gave this example. I said, well, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that right now on this TV show, I can give you a proof for God's existence that is a short axiomatic statement, that is a short sentence, that when you look at it, the sentence so perfectly proves God's existence that if you are an honest person, you cannot refute that God exists. And now, suddenly, miraculously, every atheist on earth, they see the sentence and they go, I guess I was wrong. 50 years I've been an atheist now, and all right, wow, you've just proven, yeah, okay, I can't refute this. God exists. You're right, God exists. I've been wrong. And this is what I said to the person. All right, now, all the atheists of the world now saying, okay, theoretically, you have now proven that God must exist. Now, if they are intelligent, their next question will be, all right, so what? All right, there's a God. All right, so? All right, it is not the case that there is not a God. It is the case that there is a God. I accept that. And I can state that in my own words. However, how has that changed your life as a person? So merely accepting here that, yes, there is a God, is a propositional statement that is indeed valid and accurate. That there is not a God is a propositional statement that is invalid and not accurate. Okay, I accept that. Now what? Despite that knowledge, I choose to go about my life the same way I've been living it anyway. So let's say that I'm a person who, kicks my dog every day just for the fun of hearing my dog yelp. I'm just going to keep on doing that. Let's say someone who, and I can give a million examples. Let's just say I'm a terrible person. All right, I accept that there is a God, but still I choose to continue being a terrible person. And there is a God, but I have no desire to know God. I simply accept that, yes, such a person exists. Just like, Outer Mongolia exists, but I have no desire to visit there. You see? So simply grasping something intellectually is not enough. Now the next thing is that we need to taste it. We need to want it. We need to experience it in such a way that, and not just it, what are we talking about? God. We need to know God in our lives in such a vivid way that our lives are transformed for the better. And we feel that divine presence there within us constantly on a 24-hour-a-day basis, to the point where it is a presence that is always with us, that never leaves us. And as a direct result of our communing with that divine presence at all times, we ourselves have a contentment and a peace that is unsurpassed by anything imaginable. That we have a detachment to the temporal, a detachment toward all the things of this world in such a manner that we traverse this world seemingly externally in the same way as everyone else. Like everyone else, we drive our car. Like everyone else, we go to work. Like everyone else, we get dressed in the morning. We do all these things. However, unlike everyone else, we have no attachment to any of it. And in our mind, our life can end right now. And it doesn't matter to us as long as whether we are in this body or liberated from the body, we are servants of that divine in loving devotion 24 hours a day, to the point where we transcend even time itself, and there are no hours, there are no days. Even better for us, because we wish to serve the divine within the context of eternality. When you are experiencing that, now finally, your knowledge has borne fruit. So, Narada, this is what he is saying. This is what Narada Muni is saying. To simply speculate, to live in a world, a realm of speculation, opinion, oh yeah, I agree with this, oh, but I disagree with that, oh, but wait, now it's the next day, oh, I'll switch those, I'll agree with this, disagree with that, why, I watched CNN this morning and my mind was changed. That's a fleeting world of shadow, the world of opinion. Because in the same way that shadow might seem like it has some real substance to it, if you've never seen a shadow, it might frighten you. You might think there's some weird dark person on the ground under you about to leap up on you or something. But there's no substance to it. The sun is over here, now the shadow's there. The sun is over here, now the shadow is there. Now the sun is on top of me, there's no shadow at all. Whoa, where has that shadow gone? In the same way, our opinions are the same way. Oh, my opinion is this way now. Oh, but now my opinion is that way. Right now I have no opinion. Either way, whatever happens, it's merely shadow. But instead, what is true knowledge? It is knowledge that reflects not shadow, but the light itself, you see. Opinion is that shadow. True knowledge is that sun. True knowledge is light, but a light eternal. So, finally, verse 33. Narada says, Narada Uvacha, Narada says, therefore, the path of devotional consciousness, of bhakti, alone should be accepted by those seeking liberation. So, can this be stated any more absolutely and emphatically by a person? See, not, oh, no, bhakti's nice too. Not, oh, bhakti, oh, yes, it's one of many routes to the top of the mountain and all the routes are the same, all paths are, no. This great being who is greater than any guru, greater than any rishi, he says, therefore, the path of bhakti, the path of devotional consciousness alone should be accepted by those seeking liberation. We seek liberation? We seek liberation. Number one, what's meant by liberation? For those of us who live in a post-60s world, unfortunately, the word liberation means so much today. It's often today applied to the body. Sexual liberation, political liberation, etc., etc. No, we're talking about the ultimate liberation, what I call an existential liberation. That is a liberation that is such that we are freed from all things that keep us constrained. The ultimate liberation in which our very self itself, our very identity is freed to be what it has been meant to be since before the realm of time. That is, our consciousness, our Atman, now can do what it was born to do, born, quote unquote. What is its actual nature? It can now fulfill this. That's liberation. Spiritual liberation is what we're truly talking about. Well, if that is our goal, and if our goal is indeed to have Atman experience its absolute fulfillment to its maximal degree, then we do this through bhakti. We do this through devotional consciousness, this state of being called devotional consciousness, that I translate as devotional consciousness. Now, why is this the case? You heard me say this before. Again, something else that very few other so-called gurus can even venture to begin to even contemplate, what to speak of, talk about. Liberation is not liberation. It's not that there's just this one amorphous state of being that is so above us that all we can do is kind of call it liberation and not speculate, not think about, not try to understand what is its actual nature. But there are higher and higher and higher degrees of liberation. To even be liberated in itself is simply stating in the most generic of senses that consciousness has embraced itself as consciousness, that Atman has had self-realization, Atma-jnana. But that itself is even one of the lower echelons of liberation. Technically, it is liberation, according to Patanjali and others, simply self-realization. But it's recognized in other places, all throughout the Vedic scriptures, that even that is a lower form of liberation, simply being able to turn inward and discover who I am as my true being. Even that is considered to be a lower form of liberation. Thus, we can guess that when Narada here is talking about liberation, about mukti, what he is talking about is not merely in the lowest sense, but liberation taken to its ultimate zenith, to its nth degree. This being the case, especially now we understand what he is saying. Not merely self-realization, but if you wish to have liberation in the highest sense, that is, understanding and experiencing who you are as pure consciousness, as Atman, having Atma Jnana, having what Patanjali calls Kaivalya, that is, separation from all that which is not my pure consciousness, separation from illusion and from all the accoutrements of illusion, that is, this material realm. If more, you wish to understand what is the source of you, what is the self of myself, that is, the absolute, not merely Atman, but now Paramatman, what we in common Western parlance call God, from the German Gott, the good. If we now wish to understand that, but now more, if we wish to understand that, not merely as realization, but as relationship. Now we come to the realm of bhakti proper, of devotion, in which we can have eternal, loving, reciprocal relationship with that which is our source. Thus, closed circle, reciprocal relationship of Atman and Paramatman, in such a way in which we fully experience God's love for us, which in itself is indescribable. But we also now have the ability to fully fulfill the very essence, the very raison d'être, the very reason for being of Atman itself. You see, Atman does not exist merely for itself, but to love. That is the nature of Atman. It exists to love. Even intuitively, we know this. That's why so many people talk about the importance of love in a spiritual context, from the lowest New Age, know-nothing, to even the most lofty philosophy. Everyone talks about love. They may not themselves even understand why, but this is why. It is the Atman's very reason for being, to love. This is the ultimate liberation, is not merely to understand ourselves as Atman, to embrace ourselves as Atman, but now to fulfill our very purpose as Atman. All right? So, this is why he ends this little section with this last powerful verse. Narada saying, therefore, the path of bhakti, the path of devotional consciousness alone should be accepted by those seeking liberation.
Like that last one, by those seeking liberation.
Exactly. Yeah, not just those talking about liberation, speculating. Those who are truly seeking it. Exactly. Exactly. Those who, in other words, what does that mean? Those for who they have this yearning, they must know for deeply personal reasons, yes, I want liberation, I want freedom. It's not, but our seeking liberation because we've tried everything else. We've been in this world, certainly for however many decades we've been in this lifetime, but for so many lifetimes. We've tried everything, we've done everything, and we know that nothing in this world gives satisfaction. And eventually we come to the point where we know, no, I want that thing where I have full and complete and meaningful and lasting fulfillment. And I can only have that with liberation. So those who are seriously seeking. Good. So with that, why don't we stop here and let me see if there are any questions. But anything we talked about.
So I do have a question in a broader sense of what we talked about. It relates to my confusion about the words like Atma, Paramatma, Ishwar, and Bhagwan. There has to be some separation among these words. Would you please comment? Many books confuse about, especially when we talk about Advaita Vedanta versus Dvaita Vedanta. I kind of get confused. What is Ishwar and what is Paramatma and what is Atma? Atma, Paramatma, Atma is okay. But I get confused between Paramatma and Ishwar and Bhagavan. Would you please expound on these words?
Absolutely. First of all, let's begin with a basic fundamental. Why are there so many different words to begin with? If you understand the precise Sanskrit definition of all these words, we understand that the words are indeed all different, and they're all pointing to different things. The reason why you have such precision in language, the reason why you have so many words that seem somewhat similar, but they're not, they're pointing, even however subtly, to some different aspect of the same thing, is because precisely of that precision that is necessary in order to fully philosophically understand. All right, who are we? What is that goal, that absolute? What is its nature? What perspective, what avenue are we taking in our understanding also of that absolute? So that's the first thing, is that's why there are so many words. Now, the first tremendous division that is there is Atman on the one hand, and then all the other words. They are not pointing to the same thing. We know this very simply from looking at the Upanishads. If you want, I don't know if you have this book yet, the Sanatana Dharma Study Guide that we have there. Look at that book and you will see where I quote verses from the Upanishads that talk about Atman, and I look at verses from the Upanishads that talk about Paramatman. And you'll see that it's very clear. They're talking about different things. Some people today, of course, will be confused, and they'll say, oh yes, Atman, Paramatman, oh, it doesn't matter, they're saying the same thing. Though that would be an individual who has never studied Sanskrit in their life, and who doesn't understand how unmercilessly exacting and precise the Sanskrit language is. It's like the sharpest knife. It doesn't just juggle words around. There's a reason why you have the word Atman, and then you have a separate word, Paramatman. It even explains, it goes so far to talk about the differences between the two, to the point where, again, look at this book, and I have the exact verses and verse references. It will explain that Atman is the size of 1/10,000th the size of the tip of a hair. Atman. Whereas then in a different verse it says, Paramatman, on the other hand, is the size of a thumb. So again, if they were the same thing, they would be the same size. The Upanishads would describe them in the exact same way. But it doesn't. Again and again, that's just one example where it makes this distinction. Atman and Paramatman are not the same. Otherwise, there would be one word. Atman is individual soul, individual consciousness. Each one of us is Atman. We are limited, we are finite in comparison to God. You see, truthfully, Atman is infinite. But in comparison to the true infinite, to God, God is so infinite that we seem finite. And we talked about this in the realm of physics, how there are different infinities. Infinity is not infinity. There are different kinds of infinities. Our infinity is finite in comparison to God's infinity. So that's the first distinction that there has to be. Now, as far as that absolute, there are many words for that absolute. In fact, of the ones that you use, the one that's most prevalent in the Upanishads is actually Brahman, one that you didn't even use. Yeah, so Brahman, of course, is interesting because unlike the other words, most of which are masculine nouns, Brahman is a neuter noun. It's not masculine, it's not feminine. It's pointing to the philosophical absolute. That's why it's a neuter. That's why it's a neuter. It's meant to be a term that is used as impersonally and philosophically as possible. It's like saying, oh, the absolute. That's a very impersonal philosophical term. So that's Brahman. Now, Ishvara. Ishvara simply means controller. Isha. Ishvara means that being who is the controller. And then there's Parameshwara, Parama Ishwara, which means the supreme controller. That's what that term means. Bhagavan. Bhagavan is a term that very simply means one who is possessed of 6 attributes. And there are 6 specific attributes that are discussed by Parashara Muni. I forget which one of the Puranas, but in one of the Puranas he talks about the 6 attributes of God. God is Bhagavan. He is the possessor of these 6 attributes. And on like this. So they're all referring to God on the one hand, but then sometimes they're used in a more generic sense. So for example, we can talk about, you see this even in English, we can talk about the Lord, correct? Who am I talking about? If I say the Lord, I'm talking about God, correct? The absolute. But yet, is it not the case that, for example, during medieval times, you would have the lord of an estate, just a human being, who would be, or for that matter, today, we have the landlord. You see? Now, is that person God? Of course not. This is why sometimes, once in a while, you'll even have one of these words used for someone who is not God. So, for example, here's a perfect example. Swami. God is known as Swami, or the Master. But also, we have human beings who are Swamis, who are Masters. So again, this is why sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, but it doesn't have to be. Just like in English, you have the Lord, who is God, but then you have a landlord. It just means the person who is in control. And given the contextual situation, we understand that, okay, my landlord who, lives in apartment 2A is not God. I don't have to start offering puja to my landlord. You understand from the context. In the same way, when you read the scriptures, it's important to also understand these various terms that are used in accordance with the context. Yeah, so that's why these different words are used. And then very specifically, the one of all of these that probably is the most confusing for individuals who study the Upanishads are indeed Atman and Paramatman. Why that distinction? In fact, why is God even called Parama Atman, a supreme self, the supreme self? Why is God even called that? Well, this points to the personal nature of God. In the same way that we are all Atmans, we are all selves, we are all individuals with distinct identity, with distinct personality that itself is a reflection of our own individual consciousness. In the same way, by using the term Paramatman, which the Upanishads do again and again and again, the Upanishads are making a very strong and specific philosophical statement. What the Upanishads are saying by calling God Paramatman is that God is the, not a, by definition there can't be a supreme, He is the supreme self. In other words, the Upanishads are saying very dramatically and unambiguously, God is a person. God is a personality. God is not the supreme thing, the supreme that. No, God is Paramatman. God is the supreme self. And more, this gives a linkage between our individual selves and then that supreme self. In the same way that we are a self, God also is a self, but we are finite selves, thus we are Atman. God is supreme self, infinite self, thus God is Paramatman. So again, it's amazing how in the very language itself, if we understand Sanskrit, we don't have to be Sanskrit scholars or anything. We just have to have fidelity to the precision of the language and not just kind of pretend, oh yes, all the words just kind of mean the same thing. No, they don't. Just like if I say, oh, can someone give me a glass of water, and someone gives me, a car. Oh, it's the same thing. Oh, car means water. Water means car. Car means elephant. No, we don't do that in English. We would lose our minds. Nothing would function. Reality would cease. In the same way, Sanskrit is even more precise, to the point where, yes, if the Upanishads, and they very clearly do, if they speak about Atman versus Paramatman, there is a reason why. So it points to that distinction, number one, but also it points to a unity. So what is the distinction? That we are merely Atman, whereas that is the supreme Atman, So there's that distinction, but also to a unity, that even that Supreme Atman also is an Atman in the same way that we are. So there's a unity that's there as well.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Any other questions?
Just a little comment onto that. That points up the fact that nothing can exist outside of the possibility of the infinite. You can't have a personality without there existing a personality in the Supreme.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And with the proper understanding of what is meant by personality, we know that personality in its deepest sense is non-different from who we are, from our consciousness, from our Atman. See, this is, I always point this out. This is the mistake people make. They will look at people's flawed personalities, quote unquote, and they think that's what I'm talking about, or other philosophers are talking about when they talk about personality. That's persona. Even in modern psychological terms, there's a difference between personality versus persona. And in Vedic or yogic terms, that distinction is very much recognized. What is the persona? It is the illusion to personality. It is temporary personality. It's how I'm acting towards someone else and what my personality is perceived as by them today. You see, personalities, even with one human being over the course of a lifetime, so-called personalities, will change. That's persona. That's illusion to personality. That's not what we're talking about when we say personality in this ultimate sense. We're talking about that which is the expression of consciousness itself as consciousness relates to any being outside of itself. That's personality. What is personality? How do we know someone's personality? That is the vehicle through which they communicate to us and through which we communicate with others. That's our personality. Well, in the spiritual sense, how does one Atman communicate with another Atman? Still personality, but in the eternal sense of consciousness. As one consciousness relates to another consciousness, as God, as supreme consciousness, Paramatman, relates to us, as we, as finite consciousness, Atman, relate to Paramatman, that relational vehicle is what we call personality. But in the ultimate spiritual and eternal sense, and which in itself is really not different from consciousness, but merely how consciousness expresses itself to an other. That's what we mean by personality. Thus, we are personalities. God is a personality. If God were not, this is the crux of the issue. If God were not a personality, God would not have the ability to communicate God to non-God. God would not have the ability to communicate at all. It would be a barrier if God were not a personality. Thus, for God to even have effectiveness, functionality, and ability of communication in any sense, God necessarily, by default, must be a personality. Otherwise, God would be an unattainable, unreachable, incommunicable rock. And who wants to worship that? Did you have a question? And maybe this will be the last question.
Well, that which raises another question. Could you comment on the difference between manifest and unmanifest?
In what sense?
Well, we hear that God can have unmanifest qualities and manifest qualities.
Okay.
And if they're really unmanifest, they're as you say, they're totally invisible and they're unknown to us, so they have no interest whatsoever.
No interest. Okay. No. Now I'm asking you the questions. No interest in what sense? No interest to us?
Because they're hidden in a black hole. We have no contact or access to them, and we don't know anything about them, and they have no effect on us. So if they're really totally unmanifest, presumably then they're not interesting to anybody or anything. They're virtually non-existent.
It's okay. Well, first of all, they do have existence. Actually, let's back up even a little bit more. So, manifest and unmanifest in relationship to Brahman, in relationship to God, is number one. What you're talking about. Number two, you began on the correct route toward understanding this. The unmanifest is unmanifest, quote unquote, to us. That is, to individuals who cannot see that as manifest. Let me give an example. If you look at any human being, even, what we are seeing of any human being is simply what that human being chooses to manifest before us, right? But then those hidden aspects of who they are within, their hidden desires, what's really on their mind, those aspects of their personality that they just kind of save for very few people, if anyone, that, of course, that is the iceberg underneath that tip of the iceberg that we don't see. Right? Now, okay, let's just say here's person B, you're person A. Here's person B. All of that aspect of that person's inner being, personality, etc., all the things that we just described, all those aspects that you are not seeing. So let's say, you can ascribe any number, that 95% or so of that person that you are not experiencing. So to you, of course, it doesn't have any immediate importance. You know nothing about it. You can only speculate. Okay, what is that person really like underneath the surface? I understand I'm only seeing 3%, 5%, whatever of that person. Now, number one, does that negate the fact that that person has that depth? Of course not. That person still has that 95% inside that you're not seeing. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So that's the first thing. It doesn't negate its existence. Number two, what does it say about the person who is the possessor of all of that depth? That they choose what aspect other people see. Thus, it shows that they are a personality with what? Free will. See, I will choose what aspect of me you will know. What of my desires and which of my thoughts and emotions and everything that's inside me. I will choose what you will see. Everyone does that. That's what it means to be a free being. The other thing is this. Because you are only seeing 3%, 5% now, if that person so chooses, is it not the case that, yes, they'll reveal a little bit more to you? Maybe they'll reveal 10% to you, maybe more. Of course they can do that. In the same way, now, of course, we apply this to God. The unmanifest are those aspects of God that we do not have the ability to perceive right now. That doesn't mean that it has no value. Is there anything in God that we can conceive that wouldn't have value? Of course not. Of course not. It has value, it has existence, it has meaning, but right now we are not perceiving it. Why are we not perceiving it? The number one reason, because God is a person. And He'll choose what He reveals to us, just like we will choose what we reveal to others. That's part of the self-dignity of being an individual personality. I'll choose what aspect of myself and what part of my mind I wish to share with others. I will choose that. God will choose what He wishes to share of that unmanifest. Number one. Number two, what are the various reasons, positive reasons, because there's nothing in God but positivity, but good. What are some of the positive reasons that a person, now we're getting back to humans, would not share 100% of themselves with someone? Maybe they feel, they know, well, not everyone is ready to know me fully. Maybe I'm a person with indeed such deep thoughts and such an overwhelming personality that most people can only handle a little bit. So what do most people do? Just human beings. Again, they'll share 3% of themselves with the world, but then those people who are very close to them, they'll share 10%, 50%. But even then, maybe, they might still feel that even that person who is closest to me than anyone in this world cannot fully understand me. If I were to reveal myself, it would be beyond them. That's just a human thinking this way, what to speak of God. Thus, very often, why parts of God are quote-unquote unmanifest is, all of it is certainly God's will, but much of it is because we're simply not ready. Does that make sense? Such is the nature of Brahman. That Brahman is Paramapurusha, is the Supreme Person. What Prabhupada would call very correctly, very philosophically accurately. At first, years ago, when I first encountered this term, I thought it was very unwieldy and it didn't make sense. That Prabhupada would call God the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That sounded weird to me until I began studying philosophy. And then I understood how actually that is the most philosophically accurate term that any human being ever could have come up with for what is the ultimate nature of the divine, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That of all aspects of what form the Godhead, that is the divine, that we are seeking not just an impersonal aspect, not just an abstract aspect, not just a theoretical aspect, not even just an experiential aspect, because you can experience the lower parts of a being, including God. Because you're experiencing doesn't mean that you're necessarily experiencing the highest. But what is that highest? What is that supreme? The Supreme Personality of the Godhead. That is the person as person, the deepest aspect of God. So, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
My pleasure. Very good. Very good.